Letting people in. It's 11:59. Letting people in. All right. Well, before it turns to noon, I'm going to welcome you to our next discussion of Welty at Home with Dr. Suzanne Mars. My name is Jessica Russell. I'm with the Eudora Welty House and Garden, and today we're going to be discussing At the Landing. I'm going to just remind you that your comments and questions are what it's all about. If you want to comment or question, hit the reactions button and click the raise hand button. I'll help Dr. Mars look for your hand raised. And if you have anything you want to add to the chat, there's usually a lively side discussion going on there, so don't miss out on that. And now it is noon, so I'm going to officially turn it over to Dr. Mars to kick us off on the story At the Landing.
Before we do that, Jessica, do you want to tell her what we're going to do our next time and when it's going to probably start?
Ooh, are you ready to announce?
I think so.
Okay, well, that's a big announcement. Yes, so our next Welty at Home book club pick has been chosen. And we'll mention this again on our next book club as well, but it's going to be—
Oh, that's right. We have one more. I forgot.
We have one more, but y'all have been really good, so we're going to tell you early. It's going to be Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. And Susan Allen Ford is going to be helping us to lead discussions with Dr. Suzanne Mars, and we're going to kick that off after Labor Day. So be looking for more updates on that. But we're very excited to have an Austen discussion.
And Susan can't be here today, but when she's back with us, we'll get the edition that she would like us to use for our discussion. So Jane Austen next time. Well, this today is a far cry from Jane Austen. And we have a very dark story. This story was written in the summer of 1942. Sounds like a good movie title, doesn't it? Dermot, Eudora's agent, Dermot Russell, sent the story to the Atlantic, then to Harper's Bazaar, then to Harper's Magazine. It was turned down at all of those places. And then he sent it to an unlikely source, one we really don't know much about today, called Tomorrow. And Tomorrow was a magazine that specialized in parapsychology and mystical subjects. It had literary articles. It featured, some pretty major writers like Pablo Neruda, and it had some literary criticism, but it was this kind of parapsychology magazine. So it was taken there and published there in April 1943. Tomorrow existed until sometime in the early 1960s, and then it closed down. Before Eudora finished the story, or after she finished it, before it was published, Dermot said, there are lots of ways this story could be developed into a novel. Do you want to develop it into a novel and take up a lot of these peripheral characters? And she said, no, she didn't. And so she didn't. She was resistant to a novel for a long time, but she was going to publish one. Her next book would be a novel, but she didn't want it to be from At the Landing. The story was inspired by trips she made to the Natchez Trace. She would drive down, maybe go by Windsor, drive to a town called Rodney's Landing, which was then a ghost town, and it is the basis for the landing in this story. And I've been there many times, taking groups there. I was telling Jessica, if you all want to organize a group to go there, we'll do it. You can walk up to the cemetery, which is a shelf above the town, and the headstones seem made of moss, and the hanging moss seems made of stone. There are two churches left in that town, a Baptist church, white frame Baptist church, and the Presbyterian, brick Presbyterian church. There, you can see the building that would have been the storefront probably. And then when Jenny walks down to the river, that is what we now call Grand Gulf. I assume it was called Grand Gulf then too. That's where she sees the nets, where there's a shanty boat camp, as there was in the 30s. There is in the story. And she saw fishermen and their sons throwing knives at trees. She saw chickens roosting on the, or perched on the plank leading to the shanty boats. So all of that, and she photographed it, and you can look at those photographs in both One Time, One Place, some of them, and more of them in photographs, and you'll see those images of both settings as they were in the early 1940s. She went to Rodney's Landing in Grand Gulf because she had a Guggenheim grant that was going to send her to Europe, but she got it in the spring of 1942, and it was in the spring of 1942 there was no going to Europe as a tourist, so she instead went to the Natchez Trace. A year after she published At the Landing, she published a little essay about this same territory, and it's much brighter than the story, and it's called Some Notes on River Country, and I think you might enjoy reading that. It's collected in, now I'm drawing a blank. Somebody help me. The Eye of the Story. It's collected in The Eye of the Story, a collection of essays. All right. I don't know of any incident of rape or gang rape that might have prompted Eudora to write the story, but I do think she was thinking of both the rape and the gang rape as raising issues of women's subordination and objectification, and taking it to their most extreme manifestation in rape. And so it's a, Flannery O'Connor-like technique, really writing large these issues of objectification and subordination, I think. Eudora herself had had a happy, privileged existence, one in which she was not trapped in a remote location, although some might think Jackson's a remote location, we don't. She was not trapped at Rodney's Landing. She was not denied the freedom to leave. In fact, she was encouraged to go away to college. Once she was a junior, she went to Madison, then she let her parents send her on to Columbia. She traveled freely to New York. She went down to the Natchez Trace by herself in her own car. Unlike Jenny Lockhart, she had a lot of friendships with men who treated her as their equal or superior. And men like Dermot Russell, her agent, John Woodburn, her editor, William Maxwell, fiction editor at the New Yorker, a lot of local friends like Nash Berger, Hubert Creekmore, Frank Lyle, and John Robinson. So her situation was very different from Jenny's, that the kind of freedom, the kind of encouragement that Jenny didn't have. But even Eudora, in 1934, when Hubert Creekmore, her friend who was a writer, a poet, a literary agent eventually, he formed a little magazine he called the Southern Review in 1934. And guess what position Eudora had on the Southern Review? Sort of clerk, not an editorial position. Or in 1935, her friend Frank Lyle was doing his dissertation. Guess who typed the dissertation? Eudora Welty. So there were those kinds of sort of typical, stereotypical female roles that she would be cast in. But in general, her life was very blessed. She was not in a position where her freedom was restricted. Her mother, in fact, was quite the outspoken woman, very unusual in Jackson, Mississippi. Now, despite her own privilege, Eudora knew that in Jackson and beyond, lots of women were struggling far more than she had with patriarchal assumptions. And when she went down into the Natchez Trace, I think she saw how poverty and isolation could intensify those forces and could intensify the plight of lots of women, and could encourage the indoctrination of both men and women into accepting and perpetuating this the woman's situation. So I think that'll do for the backgrounds here, my backgrounds for the story. Does anyone want to add anything else in terms of background before we start our discussion? Okay, well, let's talk about it. We thought we might start off by talking about some of the peripheral characters, and then we'll come to Jenny and Billy Floyd and the grandfather. But if we might start off talking about the women of At the Landing besides Jenny. There are three old women, especially, they're old women, but three old women are mentioned especially. There's Mag Lockhart and there's Jenny's mother. What do you think they're doing in the story? Jessica, when we were talking before we started, said, yeah, let's talk about Mag Lockhart. What's Mag Lockhart doing in here? So I think that's a good question. Harriet, you want to start us off?
I think maybe I'm responding to your, is there anything else you want to say about background?
Right.
And maybe I'll come to Mag Lockhart too. I'm just thinking about the ways in which this story, I mean, I want to underline your point that that the story of the sheltered woman is not exactly Eudora's story, but it is one that she retells. And I want to put this story in the context of Welty's treatments of a young woman's escape from sheltering, and how many stories tell it and how differently they tell it. I'm thinking from A Memory to The Winds to Livy to this story to June Recital to All of the Golden Apples to maybe The Optimist's Daughter as the last of her daughter stories, and thinking about the way in which we see young women escape sheltering into exposure, into rehearsals for love, into risk and experience, and played in very different tonal registers, with this maybe being the darkest. At least it is for me. I mean, people read this story very differently in its history of response, but for me, it is a very dark story. And I'm just thinking too about Eudora's emotional intelligence writing this story. She deprecated it at times because it got mixed responses, and I think sometimes when she got responses that were unexpected, she would maybe momentarily lose confidence in the stories. Maybe that is a trait that, like some of these heroines, but I think that it suggests her knowing things about, and may say, an emotional response to something like rape, to emotional damage, and then I was thinking too about there was something else, but maybe that's enough for now. But then Mag Lockhart, I was going to say that I just Rebecca Harrison, who I know is on here, has been written recently a paper and delivered it on Mag Lockhart, opening up the character in lots of ways. But I do read Mag Lockhart as someone who Jenny understands emotionally and identifies with.
All right, I'm going to say let's hold off on, I think all of Harriet's points about relating this story to other stories are important, but I think that's what we're going to try to do next time.
Okay.
But let's think of the story, be thinking of the story in that context for next time. And those stories of shelter and Eudora herself said, I came of a sheltered life. A sheltered life can be a daring life as well. But I think that shelter is overemphasized when we think of all the things that she did that many young women of her time period couldn't have done, wouldn't have done. So anyway, we'll think about that. John and then Susan. And then I'm going to find Rebecca here in a minute. Yeah.
Thank
John.
you. Can y'all hear me?
Yeah.
Is that okay? This, I need to, no. I interpreted this story very differently. And I think it is and I'll just cut to the punchline. Related to Meg or Mag, I think she is a hallucination. I think that, and that she never existed. I think she is a hallucination that possibly existed in Jenny's mother's mind. And I think she exists in Jenny's mind. I interpret this story that her mother had a mental illness, and perhaps even her grandfather had a mental illness, and that Jenny has a mental illness. And I think that the mental illness is that the one that it seems to me that her mother might have is that she was a paranoid schizophrenic or bipolar. I think that, my understanding is that the chances of that being inherited by subsequent generations increases as time goes along. I don't think that in the time setting, there was any treatment for it. Because I take this as sometime around maybe even the Civil War.
No, it's not the Civil War. No, this is the 30s.
Okay, the 30s. Okay, well, that's even better in many respects. A paranoid schizophrenic can be very intelligent. And one of the most famous paranoid schizophrenics in the 19th century was a chess player from New Orleans his name was Paul Murphy. But he was definitely a paranoid schizophrenic, perhaps one of the most famous paranoid schizophrenics of the 20th century is John Nash, who the beautiful.
John, can I stop you right there?
Yes.
And we'll come back to it, but I think let's start first where you were talking about Jenny may be a hallucination. It's certainly there's one point in the story where Mag may be a hallucination. Jenny is seeing Mag, and then Mag seems to disappear. But
right.
But let's also remember that there is a house, that the house is affected by the flood, that there is a tendency to see this person as real. Susan, what about you?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, when you said it was available, I thought I've seen it somewhere else. There is a separate volume that has the photographs with the notes on River Country, and also an essay by Hunter Cole. And I think the descriptions in this, I know we're going to do the characters, but the natural descriptions are so beautiful in this story, and the dilapidated house and all that. And it really makes a difference. I know I'm your art history person, but to see the photos. So it's kind of neat that University Press does have a separate book, which I'll be glad to lend anybody, but it is available because I think the photos go with this story more than a lot of other ones.
Yeah, thank you, Susan.
Just wanted to mention that.
And I do want to talk about setting, and I want to talk about the natural world and the house as well. What about Mag Lockhart? Is Rebecca here? Yeah, there I see you down there, Rebecca. You want to say something?
Sure. Thank you. I am currently working on Welty and disability studies. And so looking at particularly individuals that she targets to define as those impacted by albinism, clearly a condition that renders the body always in a state of whiteness. And the ways in which Welty's also very interested in sideshows and circus acts. And of course, we know a lot about that with Annette's book recently coming out. And so part of how I'm looking at Mag is a body that Jenny is exposed to get back to Harriet's points about exposure in her book, and the ways in which Jenny's passivity is to the point where, as we are told, she would obey even a stranger on the streets. And then thinking about when she views Mag, she's viewing this in indeterminate body, right? A body with albinism. But what she's doing is she's observing a body that is out in the sun, a body that is tending flowers, much like Snowdy in The Golden Apples, a body that engages with and survives Floyd, a body that also speaks back. We have that beautiful moment where Mag says something along the lines of, "You are not, it is not, I am not," right? Which is a defiant voice, in my opinion, where you are not, where she's kind of, Mag is speaking back to how Floyd would define himself. It is not, speaking back against what she believes the experience to be. And I am not, right? Being defiant against the social narrative of self. And when Jenny's watching this, she's sitting up there on that stile, essentially next to her mother's grave, which is also has the name Lockhart written on it. And so part of what I do with the character is play with how Jenny can't see, right? She's literally got Mag in front of her defying this narrative, and she's got her mother who is dead, right? Something that I would argue is kind of foreshadowing her own death if you are in the camp that believes she is dead at the end. And what she misses is this narrative that may be called a freak, and I'm putting that in quotes clearly, in society, because it's not passive womanhood, but it is alive, it is well, and it is surviving that narrative in the text, that oppressive masculine narrative.
I have a couple of observations about that. The name Lockhart, which suggests that Jenny's mother has married into this family, which would also, I think, say something about class. Why Jenny's mother might have been shut in her room. Maybe she has married into a family that the grandfather disapproves of. Is there that kind of class distinction? And that after what happens after Jenny watches Mag and Billy Floyd is, and Mag says, "I am not, you are not, it is not." There's this kind of denial of identity, and that's when Jenny thinks about walking down into the well, where desperation, or a landscape, I'd walk down into the well, and this kind of suicidal thought. So I've also associated Mag with this kind of but I take your point, Rebecca. She's active as Jenny is not, but she's also clearly disturbed, and maybe there is this she is Jenny's double, but maybe she's the double that pushes towards despair. I don't know. Ray, you want to come in? I bet you have something to say about John's comments too, don't you?
You're muted, Ray.
Yeah.
Yes, I do. Actually, you foretold that. I sign on with John on the unreality of all this, though I don't go that far. And I don't quite endorse schizophrenia, but I don't blame him for doing it. One thing about this story is that I see the two main characters, Billy and Jenny, as children. And there are a lot of indications of that they have no moral authority, they no footprint in town, no social footprint. And Mag has a play day, end quote, with Billy Floyd. So they're shown as children there. They go into the store down in the village, and they have nothing to say to each other. They meet, they have nothing to say, and they have nothing to say to anyone else. So they're like children, and that's an unreality. It pushes the story in Miss Welty's tension between the real and the unreal, the fractured logic towards the unreal. And then particularly the serial rape pushes the story towards the unreal. That is not a part of the society that we know, and it would not be treated like a walk in the park like it was. It was just discounted. You didn't know whether Jenny was suffering or rejoicing. And the old woman blesses the event. It does have the positive of putting Jenny into society where she must go, but it has this terrible drawback. So in response to John somewhat, I say it is unreal, but I see a different kind of unreality.
I think the old woman at the end, to me, the old woman at the end is saying, is she asleep? Is she in a spell? Is she dead? And she says it to the men. And then she looks out to the water with a kind of dignity. But it seems to me she's the one person that asked these men, what have you done? So maybe I'm misreading that. Maybe I'm, so I don't read the ending. Well, I think there's some ambiguity there, Ray. I agree with that. Yeah. Is it rejoicing or is it horror? But I think especially with that last image we end with, the boys throwing their knives at the tree. It seems so dark to me that is this image of horror. And that the subordination, which would reduce you to childhood if you're not given any freedom. Yes. And women are expected to acquiesce in the decisions of men. And I think that's what's being written large here at the end. So with the wives who don't protest. They're angry, but they don't protest. They don't. Let's let Beverly and we'll come back.
You know, this is a disturbing story. Every time I read it, I just wonder what Chestina thought when she, when she read this, what was her reaction. But, also we talked about the sheltered life. I mean, Jenny is also what happens if your family locks you away. Mm-hmm. The grandfather has more or less locked her away because of whatever crimes, marrying the wrong person, not staying in her social status, whatever the issues are, and we are led to believe that there were some. Maybe she is mentally ill. Maybe that's why. But Jenny, let's say she is young teenager age. We don't know exactly how old she is, but she doesn't know how to function in society. She doesn't know how to go into the store. I mean, she whispers to the men to tell them when her grandfather dies, and she's left in this cabin, with the dead guy. And then she gets stressed up and she has to handle all this. And she obviously has not been taught to communicate with people. So, I wonder if at some point her grandfather, who seems so courtly, with his robe, and they go out and eat in the gazebo and all of that, if it didn't occur to him what was going to happen to her when he died, which he would inevitably do at some point. And so I viewed her as not so much being mentally incompetent as being mentally unprepared and emotionally unprepared and just sheltered away. And then, like that little girl in the crawdad story, in real life, that girl would have been eaten by the gators, but she manages to survive, but Jenny does not. I mean, she is not surviving. She may be dead, like you said, but she has no tools to help her once she has to walk out of that house.
Yeah, the shelter is
yeah.
Sarah.
So I want to add 2 more filters or lenses on the discussion that we're having about Jenny. One is point of view. So I've been catching up with the videos on your discussions, and I saw that you discussed free and direct discourse last time. In this story, the narrator stays with Jenny until the end, and the narrator flips out and gives us the community. And so we stay in Jenny's mind. And I think that's why we get the questions about, Does Jenny have a mental disability? Does Jenny see reality? Because we are staying right in Jenny's head and we don't know what is real or what is not real, because the narrator doesn't separate enough until the ending. And then we get that brutal reality coming in at the end, because that's the third person narrator coming in. Through Jenny's point of view, I feel like we also are getting a genre story. Jenny thinks of the world as a fairy tale. She is very childish, as a couple of our people have said. And so everything is fairy tale to her. She talks about the prisms in her house and Floyd on horseback coming with his hair always flowing like it's got a fan on it. I mean, she's definitely thinking in terms of this particular genre, and it is the wrong genre to read what's happening to her. And so I think that point of view and genre help us think through the unreality of the story.
I think so too, Sarah. And I also think that Jenny is a romantic.
Yeah.
And she's a romantic. She wants to see things in romantic terms. And she is conflating sexual desire and love, or a relationship. She says that she loves Billy Floyd, but she's just seen him. I mean, they walk up and down the path together, and she's never had a conversation with him. She knows nothing about him, and but she thinks she loves him, and she is romanticizing that and the possibilities, I think. Monica and then Elta.
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to Sarah's point about reading this as that Jenny's point of view is seeing this as a fairy tale.
Mhm.
And this is exactly what fairy tales are about, but this is kind of like giving us the seamy underbelly of Sleeping Beauty or something, right? Of that actually fairy tales are terrible. So I like this as a kind of examination of the genre.
Yeah. The reality beneath the fairy tale. Yeah. Elta.
That's precisely what I was going to say, Monica, is this is innocence and illusion and fairy tale versus brutal reality, and what happens when they overlap. And the fairy tale, I loved this story. I thought it was exquisitely done, but disturbing. But I did read it in fairy tale and mythic sorts of terms.
Harriet.
So, I'm thinking about the fact that, of course, Welty has written a fairy tale just before she's written this, which is The Robber Bridegroom, and it has very much a similar plot in the sense that Jamie Lockhart has come and ridden his red horse into the woods of Rosamond's dreaminess, and he has taken what he had left her the day before when he steals her clothes the first time. And again, there's this kind of blurring between fantasy of love, sexual rehearsals, and rape, and a blur between consensual sexuality and rape. And at the same time, there's an illusion between the kind of mythic hero and the rapist. And in the fairy tale version that Welty tells, Rosamond can retell the story with lies falling from her mouth like rubies and diamonds, and gets control of the story in a way that makes it a fairy tale, that makes it a story about love. Whereas this is replaying in another genre. This is naturalism. This is the horror of a young woman who is thinking with certain culturally prescribed female traits, like obedience and quietness. And I'm thinking about her relationship to the prisms, are about pleasure, and she sees them glimmering, and she appreciates them, but she will not touch them. She won't reach for them. A kind of femininity that is taught to hang back. And I'm thinking about those prisms as metaphoric of Jenny herself, glimmering with lights that that are enclosed in the prison and trapped there.
Yeah, and that the rape at the end is the mirror or the doubling of the rape in the center of the story. One treated as of taking freely of what was free, and Jenny letting it pass, cleaning herself afterwards, cleaning out, but going towards Billy Floyd, and the other.
Yeah,
brutally-
to speak to John,
realistic.
I do think we're just full of being in, when I say that I think that this story conveys to me Welty's emotional intelligence, her knowing what a response to trauma is about, and how it is met with evasion or with autoaggression or with fantasy, but that we're in a mind that is problematic, partly because of cultural prescription, and partly because of the events that occur. And so I agree with John's sense that that we're looking at a mind which is troubled.
All right, John, and then Joellen.
I want to, this goes back to your original first question, and Professor Mars, and it has to do with the three old women.
Mm-hmm.
And an impression that I had from reading the story, which that I interpreted the three women to be the three fates, and of Greek
They got
mythology.
their scissors out, don't they, John? They're snipping those threads.
They do
Yeah.
they have their sisters, and they have this dialogue, and it ends with one of them saying that they could take, as if they could take his, and his is Billy Floyd's, life up into their fingers with their sewing and sew it or snip it on their laps. That's a line in there. And the other thing, I do think it's extraordinarily disturbing. I think that there is an evolution of Jenny's thinking about grace and experiencing love, and when one experiences it. I also think that there is, because of that, what the three fates, or the three ladies, I shouldn't, that's just my interpretation, what the three ladies have to say about Billy Floyd, and that he might be an Indian, and by that, a Native American Indian, that there's a real clash of culture here. And there's the potential for a real clash of culture in the way that Billy Floyd looks at the world, and the way that that anybody that was a part of her prior world looked at it. And that's another thing that is, to me, is going on. And so can I say, I definitely think that he raped her. It says he violated her. I think that was a very carefully chosen word, deliberately chosen word, but her response to it is what matters. And she has an extraordinary response that, and it was, to me, the first time I read it, it was repelling or repellent. But as she goes on, she is going through what grace and love is in her own mind. And I've said this before about somebody, but I just think that love is inexplicable, and that we just can't predict how people are going to respond to other people. I'll stop. That's all I wanted to say.
So, yeah, so Joellen.
I kind of need to slow things down just a little bit and take a look at the process that Jenny it goes through in this story, where she doesn't touch anything even at home, but there's a point where she touches Billy Floyd, she speaks, she says his name, and we build up to a moment of romance where, they're both tiptoeing around the butterflies and all of this sort of thing. And I think that Welty wants us to believe in those romantic possibilities. I mean, I think at the end of Livy, for example, we're supposed to be delighted by the light on the pear tree, but still we recognize that they don't get any farther than the doorway. They don't actually get out of the house. In this story, we get beyond the sex, the violation into that. But as part of the process, even before that, or is it the store? After Jenny's father dies, and we haven't really mentioned the store yet, because it's in the store scene that Jenny actually sees Floyd diminished.
Mm-hmm.
And she doesn't accept that. She doesn't fold that into her experiences. He's close, used, worldly, handled, and strong as an odor of the old playing cards. And some of the old women think that he's the bastard child of one of the old card players. But I think that Billy Floyd is maybe a little more complicated. He's not just of the world that we see him in at the end, where he lives with the men at the camp, a horrible world of men. And he responds to Jenny in the store to some extent as he would in that world. He doesn't want to respond to her there. It's another world of men. But I think it's kind of complicated.
I agree with you. It's more complicated. And I mean, he does come for her. She says, "You saved my life." He doesn't have to take his boat there.
No.
I mean, and if he wanted to rape her, there are many times he could rape her without having to come in the middle of a flood to save her. And
yeah, he takes his time too. I mean, yeah. in that sense. But there is still a darkening of the moment where he jumps on the horse and all this stuff. And I think that section ends with the two words vaunting and prostration. Right. And we know those are gendered, that the male can, beat his chest and love the world in this kind of moment, whereas the female can't quite do that anyway.
The other thing about Billy Floyd as an Indian, a Natchez Indian, the Natchez who in a massacre for a massacre responded to the French or is it the French responded to the Natchez, but in any case, who were slaughtered by and driven out of existence. He's like the one from Atlantis. There's a kind of romanticism in that of being that Natchez Indian, the heroic Indian. But I think John's right. It's also a question of race. And what do you make of this race? Okay, we've got Harriet, Jacob, and Helen.
I'll just mention that I found one of the two paintings on the wall that are her mother's paintings is the massacre at Fort Rosalie. And I did find that painting online, and I'll try to put it in the chat, but it is the Natchez Indian massacre at Fort Rosalie. But the Natchez Indian story is also associated with Atlantis and with surviving the flood. And so anyway, to what I really want was Jenny. I want to say that Floyd's rape of Jenny is blurred in the text by her desire to consent. Jenny has longed for her isolation to be breached. She has dreamed of Floyd and has been rehearsing to release her own sexuality. She sought him out, even though in her fantasies, Jenny's already understood and admitted the extent of Floyd's inappropriateness to her fantasy, that he is, that her wishing, her conventional wishing for a little house has nothing to do with the Floyd who is one character outside in her fantasies, and another one when he's in domestic spaces like the store, where he has an odor and is disturbing in a way where he's outside, he's free and beautiful. I'm thinking about Floyd as a character, a masculinity that's described as dangerously free. I'm thinking about about Toni Morrison's use of that phrase in The Bluest Eye to describe the father Charlie, if I'm remembering his character the right name. It's been a while since I've read it. But that idea of a masculinity which is dangerously free, has a tremendous appeal, is presented as a kind of heroism, but is also presented here as is undercut in a way that presents it as a problematic masculinity. And when it's paired with a femininity that is about obedience, silence, with a lack of freedom.
I think it's also the whole American notion of self-reliance. And self-reliance, all virtues are comprehended, says Emerson. Well, maybe not. I mean, if all you think about is self and let me rely on myself, and I can go out on the river in the midst of a flood, and I can take Jenny whenever I want to, you're a threat and you're kind of self-absorption, I think.
Well, the power of the story might be about ambiguity, both in the level of sexuality and also in the level of masculinity. The ambiguities are where the story is really good.
Jacob.
I agree about the ambiguity of the story, and I want to start by saying I agree that this is a story about rape. The degree to which rape creates a traumatic space for this character. I mean, I think the story reminds me a lot of The Yellow Wallpaper, in that we learn very quickly we can't fully trust what this character's thinking, and we have to kind of piece clues throughout. Now, that being said, to my understanding, there's a theory. I don't know if this is true. Maybe I'm making this up. There's a theory about trauma, especially in children. I don't know, maybe they've done studies on this, that like kids, some of their first memories are traumatic. Fairy tales are traumatic. They're meant to scare people. Stephen King has said fairy tales, the scariest tale is Bambi. We're meant to scare children, to teach these cautionary tales and such. This is putting me in a dangerous place to say. What's interesting to me about the story is how her rape, in a way, seems to free her at the end. She leaves. Some of the most transcendent language from the whole collection arrives after the rape in section 3. Some of the most succulent, beautiful language on page 307. That beautiful, beautiful sequence in which Jenny imagines going through her old house and lighting it up as if she's been activated by this event. Again, I'm not trying to be an apologist for what happened. It's a horrifying thing that occurred, but in the end, I find it weirdly, potentially hopeful that she leaves, that there's this scene of her at the river. It says she's waiting for Billy, but there's so much possibility there. Maybe her life is going somewhere. Her life did not seem to me so good before Billy. In a way,
Don't you think, Jacob, though, that part of the problem is that she's not independent? What she has found is not independence, but a seeking for another guide, that she's still looking for a man to show her the way rather than making her choice.
I'm trying to give a kind of that aiming towards what Joellen said about this.
I agree with you.
Complex story.
She needs to leave. What she's wanted from the first is the ability to come and go. She needs to leave. And I think she needs love. And
it's a first love story.
Yeah, it's a possibility. Love is the possibility, but is Billy Floyd the answer to that? Helen, you go.
Just a small thing. Welty's use of the word violent when Billy rapes her. If this is in her point of view, she didn't have violence in her vocabulary. So she would not have thought, Jenny would not have thought of that as being violent. So Welty gives us that indication then, and it's quickly followed by, I was going to bring up the the Natchez Massacre, which is already been discussed now, but that follows the word violent in the next scene. And that was one of the most horrific kind of massacres in history.
Mm-hmm.
So she makes a jump from Jenny, who doesn't know the word violence, but Welty does. She makes an exception and uses it there, and then she brings in the Natchez massacre, and that just multiplies the violence so much. So that was all I was going to say.
Thank you, Joe Ellen.
I'm going to take a real flyer here, but I've noted already that there's a lot of story left after the moment of romance, rape, and consequences. I can say that at the top of page 307, the comment said, but at last this trembling left. This is after Jenny's at home cleaning, and dull strength came back, as if a wound had ceased to flow its blood. And I've wondered, okay, was she violated once? They were up there a long time. Was that repeated? Could she have gotten pregnant? I mean, certainly in Welty's considerations of consequences to women, this certainly could come up. And I noted then, I just kept reading with that in mind. And it seemed to me there's so much emphasis in some of the language Jacob mentioned on her radiance, a radiance touching her heart, moving within her, centers inside. And then contrast that to the bottom of the page where section 3 begins, and the 3 old women celebrate her ruin. Do they just because they know where she's been, or she's showing as a pregnancy or whatever? But then finally on page 310, where the comment is made, there's nothing left but a following after. It's too late to find any way alone. And just, that may be just going out on a branch that we don't need to go on to interpret this story. But it did make a little bit of sense for me of some of the language here and there.
I was going to go back to John's point about the old women as the fates, because there's what they do say is, why don't you run after him? Now you won't love him anymore, for they always did pay a visit to say those words. And it's as if they have everything scripted and that they're very fatalistic, and they're not defensive of her. They're not saying, this is a horrible thing that happened to you. They're just viewing it as part of the course of events to which she is, or women are subject, seems to me. Yeah. All right, Harriet.
A couple of thoughts. One is, in all that stuff that we haven't talked about, I was thinking about the portrait of the flood and how differently I read it after my vicarious experience of Katrina. That Welty is really good on the flood and on the need and on cleaning it out. I read that cleaning out as a response to her violation. But I think it also has a level of understanding what flood is, and if Floyd is a homophone for flood in this story, and it is Jenny has been in drought, and then the flood, and then water comes, but it's not rain, it's flood. And I am thinking, when I was talking about Welty's emotional intelligence, I'm thinking about her understanding responses to trauma. I'm thinking about responses to rape being splitting off, denial, regression, suppression, autoaggression, identification. And there are 2 ways of reading this ending. And one has been sometimes that it is that there is a rejoicing and awakening. I don't see that at all in the end of this story. I do think that in this that it's a little bit like Jenny extinguishes the lights in the house of her mind, and that in this state she is quoting, is waiting for Billy Floyd, her face hung with a smile, no matter what was done to her, like a bit of color that kindles in the sky after the light has gone. The women ask her these questions that are like fairy tale questions. Is she asleep? Is she in a spell? Will Prince Charming come and awaken her with a kiss?
She's not asking Jenny, she's asking the men those questions.
She is, but they are. But I'm saying that those questions are not going to be answered in any fairy tale way. That what we get instead is that laughter. That is one of the most frightening laughs in American literature. I think I can think of another in Hawthorne and one in Richard Wright. But her long silence is overwhelmed by the boatman's callous laughter. And while she has tried to tell a story of love, she's silenced her laughter. And then we hear the dull, inarticulate pit of the boys throwing knives at a tree that reverberates for me as casual, unconcerned violence. And so I read the ending as suggesting. There you go, telephone call. Okay.
I thought I'd turned that off.
Well, okay. I just think I read that the ending is we see Jenny as a portrait of some very familiar. Oh, I know what I was going to say. There's even a sense of autoaggression, I think, in her submission to the gang rape. That there is just a hint of her not handling a situation, but putting herself in a situation in which she's hurting herself.
Let me see if Cheryl still has something for us. Cheryl, are you still there?
Well, I saw Jo Ellen raise her hand, and I wanted to hear her insight before.
You want to hear Jo Ellen first, and then
I just want to say that the story starts with Jenny's grandfather and the high water, and he says it has come. And so my question is, what has come? And the grandfather mentions Billy Floyd and the catfish and the flood. And so I just, is there any great significance in the grandfather standing outside the door of her room, speaking that it has come, like a prediction? But that, we can cover next time or something.
Oh, well, the answer to your question is yes. And in fact, this opening section really at first writing came at the end of the first section, and Eudora took it and moved it to the beginning. She scrambled the chronology intentionally. And I think when she does that, she's introducing, to me, that she wants to use that section to introduce all of the key issues in the story. It's setting it up, and the power of the grandfather, the power of the flood, the equating of Floyd and flood together, that what has come is the flood, but what has also come is Billy Floyd and this catfish, this kind of phallic symbol he carries on his wrist, and the idea of that going free, Billy Floyd's going to be freed here. All of that seems to me to be set up.
Thank you.
And emphasized by moving it to the first. Now let's see what Jo Ellen and then Rebecca have to say.
I'll forgo the dream part, but I think that's important, Cheryl, that section. I just wanted to raise point of view again, and I think Sarah might have something to say about this. We were talking about free and direct discourse last time, and I made the argument that it seemed to me that we could have been in Livy's mind much more than we often think we are. In this story, I don't think that's the case at all. And I think probably there's some lines to be drawn between when we're sort of the narrative voice blends with Jenny's and when it doesn't. But at the end, I really think that point of rejoicing has so often been misread because of that point of view shift in part that Harriet raised. And that, I mean, there have been people who've written even that Jenny might have been rejoicing to some extent herself. but it says it somehow both the harsh human sounds, the men's laughs and her cry could easily have been heard as rejoicing going out over the river by night. Immediately, the little boys are mentioned. And they certainly, certainly a lot of men like to think that that's what Jenny's response might have been, I think. But then they're slapped by their mothers as if they knew that the original smile now crossed Jenny's face, kind of assigning her a smile, putting that word rejoicing so close in terms of her reaction. And I don't think that that connection should be made here at all.
I agree with you. Rebecca and then Sarah, and then we'll better call it quits for today. Rebecca?
Yeah. Yes, I was just going to add that I think, to get back to Harriet's point about this dangerous masculinity that's allowed to run free, that there's no real sense of justice there. I wanted to add that there also seems to me that the flip side of that is a kind of complicit femininity that Welty is underscoring here. And I'm reminded of that and thinking back to the robber bridegroom, with someone like Rosamond, who watches the Natchez woman who is literally completely desecrated on that table. And then as soon as Jamie's home, just goes straight and hops in the bed with him, with the woman literally laying there on the table. And I think that we see some of that here as well, because these three women, as was mentioned earlier, I mean, they taunt Jenny about Billy Floyd, as we are told to, quote, delight in her ruin. There's no sort of sense of kindness or any kind of understanding woman to woman. We have the section that was just read by Jo Ellen, where the women by the fire, they know this original smile is now hanging on her face. They slap their sons, but they don't get up and go do anything. Or even the old woman at the end who asked those three fairy tale questions. There's a strong disconnect there between what they say and what should be said, which is, what have you done to her? Right, in light of that bigger scene there. And so I think that Welty's also kind of pointing to a complicit feminine narrative that also that is supporting these larger, more violent patriarchal narratives that tie back to this dangerous masculinity.
So the feminine complicity, we all might also say that in the landing, in the more formed social order, there is a controlling of the sexuality of the women, and rather than I will choose who you marry. You will not leave my house, which is rather different from what happens at the opposite of what's happening at the end. Okay, Sarah?
Rebecca did such a lovely job, and Suzanne, you sort of wrapping up the larger issues. I'm going to go tiny and small here with my comment, responding to Jo Ellen. I do think the free discourse flips at the end and we get the community view. However, Welty is so subtle and so cagey that there's a lot of speculative language used in this community view. There's a lot of as ifs, as if the mothers thought their sons were thinking this, as if she said, go back. So we're not even sure through that community view that we are getting what's happening, because the narrator there and that free discourse is using speculative language to say, maybe this is what's happening, but maybe not. And so it's really hard to pin anything down at that ending because of the as ifs there.
Very good. Thank you, Sarah. Any last comments? Jessica, is Zoom going to cut us off? Are we okay?
It may cut us off in a little bit.
So we're overdue, so I think we better quit, but thank you very much. I do find I reread the story 3 times for class. Usually I might read it another time, but it is so disturbing to read. I couldn't make myself read it one more time. And I think it's a great story, but I think it's a very troubling story. And there you are. Jackknifed, as Eudora would say. I'll tell you about that another time. All right.
All right. See you next week.
Thank you so much. Fantastic class. Thank you.